at the Concord Museum in their newest wing. It's a wonderful place. The entire museum houses thousands of artifacts from the historic region. It's open daily except for Mondays. Now, we're only a stone's throw from the North Bridge, where all those unpleasantries with the British started oh so many years ago. But today, we come in peace to look at a bed that they've kindly removed from storage and set up so that I can show you. As you can see, it's a four-poster, nice, robust turnings. The posts, I'm told, are maple. The headboard is pine, scrolled in serpentine, and it has a couple different paints on it, some red and some black that's been somehow brushed on. The rails are good and solid, and the original bed had a rope foundation. But the thing that really attracts me to this piece are the turnings. They're not too complicated, and I think they'd make a good project for our new lathe. So I'll take some measurements to get a pattern, and we'll get back to the shop and see what we can do. Now, this bed was fun to build. Even though I'm not an experienced wood turner, I can see how people can get addicted to it. Now, just like the original, I made the turnings and the bed frame from maple and the headboard from pine. Now, the challenge with this project is actually the posts. They're 54 inches high, and since my lathe will only handle 3-foot capacity, I had to make the turning in two pieces, a lower piece, which is the square section, and the foot, onto which sits the upper turning that has a dowel. It just fits down in there. It'll get all glued together in the final assembly. I also want to take a moment to talk about shop safety. Be sure to read, understand, and follow all the safety rules that come with your power tools. Knowing how to use your power tools properly will greatly reduce the risk of personal injury. And remember this, there is no more important safety rule than to wear these safety glasses. Now, I found it very useful to draw up a full-scale pattern of the turning that I'm going to do. So here you see the upper post drawn at full scale from the notes I took at the museum. And it's useful because it gives me a real good idea of what I'm trying to form in its full size. And also, when I'm using my calipers, which is my measuring tool, I can just hold it on the full-scale drawing, set it to the right diameter, and transfer it to the piece I'm turning rather than measuring everything. Also, it's useful to help me make these guide sticks, which is simply a piece of wood with marks at all the critical turnings that I'll use to transfer pencil lines onto the turning as I get ready to start. Now, the stock itself is 3.5-inch square maple that I've trued up nice and square. The first step is to find the center point at each end. So I'm using this centering tool. It has a 90-degree ledge that hooks over the side of the piece, and I'll draw a line from every corner. I like to do all 4 sides, because if my piece is slightly out of square, it'll average it out. Now, with center holes punched in each end of the blank, I'm going to go to the headstock section of the lathe, which contains a motor, some drive belts, which all lead to this shaft, into which this piece fits. I like to think of it as a clutch. It's called a spur drive. And these little spurs, when they're pressed into the wood, will hold the stock while the lathe turns. Now, there's no sense in removing with chisels anything I can remove with the table saw. So looking at my full-scale pattern, I check my measurements, and I see that 3 3/8 is the largest diameter. And since my blank is 3.5, I'm just going to take a compass, give myself a little extra, and draw a circle to set my saw to knock off the corners. Mounting the blank is pretty straightforward. First, at the headstock end, I install the piece, making sure the spurs are in the impressions that I made. And down here, at the tailstock end, there's another center. This time it's a cup center. It has a sharp edge, sort of a concave shape, and a centering point. And I just turn the centering point into the pre-punched hole, and then the cup center into the wood as I turn it, so that it engages about a 1/16 or 1/8 of an inch into the piece. Now, because this is what's known as a dead center, which means only the wood spins, not the center, I'm going to put a little drop of oil for some lubrication. Okay, that seems to be pretty well set. Now, before I do any turning, I want to put on this face mask, because you never know when a piece of wood might come flying off the lathe. I'm going to turn the lathe on at a very low RPM to check the balance, about 500 RPM. That seems to be okay. So now I'm going to move the tool rest within about 1/8 of an inch of the blank, and lock it in place. And I'm going to start out using the widest of my gouges. All right, that seems to be pretty round now, at least in that section. So now I'm going to move the tool rest down and start taking care of the next area. Okay, I'd say that's pretty good. Now I'm going to take my gauge stick and transfer my marks along the cylinder. Now I'm just going to take my calipers and set them to where I want to start turning. And I'm going to start down at this end here, and I'm going to set them a little bit wider than what I need, because I can always fine-tune it later. Now, using a parting tool, I'm going to cut in and keep checking until I get it to the distance that I want. Okay. This end of the turning down here, the last 3 inches, is going to be the dowel that connects the two pieces. That's 2 inches in diameter. Well, now that I've cut V-grooves in here, now I'm going to use a small gouge and create the beads. And what I'm doing here is actually bringing the gouge up to the ridge, and to go over to the top edge, I just sort of roll it and then swing it around. Now what I'm doing is just putting a couple little V-grooves on each side of what will become a little bead. And before I cut the bead in the center, I'm putting a couple little coves. Just taking off of here. Okay. Now I'm going to switch to a smaller gouge, and I'll just bead over the rib in the center, taking it all the way down to the cove that I just made. Now I'm ready to start shaping this long element here. So I'm going to go to my largest gouge and start roughing it out. Now at this point, I'm starting to trim down the last 3 inches that becomes the dowel, and I want that to be exactly 2 inches in diameter. So that my dowel is nice and straight, I'm going to use my scraper to get a straight edge on it. Now the only thing I have to do is smooth up any ridges that are left with a little bit of sandpaper. Okay, well that pretty much takes care of the sanding. Now I'm ready to remove it from the lathe, but up here at the very top of the post, I want this to come almost to a point. So I'll trim that off and it'll come right from the lathe. Now that's how I turn the upper portion of each post. Now the lower portion is a little bit different. There's a square section into which the rails are mortised, and it's turned down below. Because it's full-size square up here, I won't be able to go to the table saw and knock the corners off. I'll have to do all the work at the lathe. Now on the lower turning, the square portion has the corners just slightly rounded over. And that's probably the most difficult part of the turning to actually do, because if you go in too quickly, you'll split the corner. So I'm just going to use my broad gouge and just very carefully round over the corners. Now with my scraper, I'm just going to try to clean it up just a little bit, ever so gentle a touch. Boy, you can generate a lot of wood shavings from just a couple turnings. Well, now what I have to do is drill a 2-inch hole in the top of the square portion so the dowel from our upper turning can fit into it. That has to be perfectly straight. So that sort of rules out drilling it by hand. Could take it over to the drill press and try that, but I don't think it'll work very well. The best way to do it is to take the chuck out of the drill press, install it in the lathe, turn the piece end for end, and just ease it into the bit. It works pretty well. Now the bit that I've chosen is a 2-inch Forstner bit. I'm going to put a little board here which is cut the correct height so that the center of the block will be in the right position. It helps me hold everything. That end against the bit. This end, I'll just turn my tailstock into it. Now, unlike a drill press where you actually pull the bit into the work, this wheel will push the board into the drill bit. Now, the other thing is that the piece is going to want to spin. So I'm just going to put a clamp on it so that I can hold it as I drill the hole. Pretty good. Now we've got some more holes to drill. Now the long rails of the bed are mortised into the post. And that's what this layout is right here. It's a 2-inch wide by 2 1/4-inch high mortise. I'll drill a hole to remove most of the material, and then I'll clean out the corners with my mortising machine. On the opposite side, I also have to drill a couple holes. A 1 1/4-inch counterbore for the washer and nut, and a 3/8 through hole for the bolt. And I'll do all that at the drill press. Okay, now to the mortising machine. Now this is a very useful machine. It's a single-purpose piece of equipment that does mortising. A round drill bit that passes through a square chisel are all you need to make perfectly square holes. Okay, that takes care of the mortise for the long rails. Now on the adjacent side I need to make a smaller mortise for the short rails. Have another look at the prototype again. The footboard and the headboard are let into the post, into a mortise. They're a little tougher to make. In order for this turning to sit absolutely flat, I have to make a couple shims to compensate for the differences in diameters between this point and this point. Once those are set, the piece is now parallel to the bottom of the table and to the fence, and I can cut my mortise. Now I'm going to turn it around and widen the mortise. Okay, now I'm going to try a little scrap of wood which is equal in thickness to the headboard pieces and just tap it in place. Okay, and that's good. Now to make sure that the upper mortise lines up with the lower mortise, I'm simply going to take a framing square and put it up against the wedge or the piece that I just drove in and draw the side lines of the upper mortise. Well, last night I stuck around long enough to glue up some pieces for the long rails and the short rails. And I used 6/4 stock, 2 pieces for each, because I didn't want to pay the high price of 16/4 stock, and after all, I'm not going to turn these pieces. Now what I've done is run it through the joiner so I have one true edge that's square to the side, and now I'll take it to my surface planer and true it up. Well, now I'm ready to cut the tenons on the end of my rails. So I set up my stacked dado head cutter in the radial arm, and I've installed a stop block to control the length of the tenon. And now I'll just run the sides of each piece through. I've made a slight adjustment to the height of the saw, and now I'll cut the top and bottom of each tenon. Well, I also spent some time last night gluing up some 3/4 inch thick pine boards to make blanks for the headboard and the footboard. Then I traced the outline of the cutout from a poster board pattern that I made, much like the pattern at the Concord Museum. Now I'm just cutting it out with my handheld jigsaw. When I'm finished, I'll sand all the edges nice and smooth, and then we'll be ready for some assembly. Applying a little bit of glue to the tenon and to the inside of the mortise. The first thing I'm going to put together is the short rail. Slip that through, clamp it in place, and then I'll secure the joint with one screw. Later the bed bolt will pass through it and really secure it. Okay, now to attach the headboard to the post, I'm just going to use glue. Just slip them into the mortises. Well, now I've applied glue to the dowel and to the socket, and we'll see if we can tap it all into place. Okay, that's about all I'm going to get out of that. Now we'll assemble the footboard. Now to connect the long rails to the head and footboard, I'm using what is known as a hanger bolt. It's a lag type screw on one end and a thread for a nut on the other end. The first thing I want to do is drill a hole through the tenon of the short rails. Now with the headboard removed, you can see that when I drilled through with the large drill, I just went far enough to give me an indicator mark, which I'll use now for a 1/4 inch bit for a pilot screw. Now I'll just thread the hanger bolt into that hole. Okay, now one more dry run at the fit, put it together, and bolt it down. Okay, that's good and sturdy. Now I'll disassemble it, do the final sanding, and get ready to put some finish on. Now I've decided to stain all the maple elements of the bed using sort of a dark stain known as American walnut. It's a water-based stain. Once it's dry, I'll put on a couple coats of satin polyurethane. Now for the pine, I'm going to treat that a little differently. Now you get to see what the turnings and the rails look like with a couple coats of water-based satin polyurethane. Now the first step in treating the pine is to put on a coat of acrylic latex primer. And finally, a nice coat of Wedgwood blue.
Norm's back with another new Yankee classic.